Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Courtney Lindy, and I am the Digital Marketing Manager here at Alcami. I welcome you to today's webinar, Elemental Impurities, Missed the Deadline, Now What? Today's session will be recorded and made available to you in the coming days. And if anyone has any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the Q&A section of your toolbar, and we will be sure to answer those questions at the end. So at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Chris Williams, to begin today's presentation.
Hello, so I guess a quick brief introduction. I am Chris Williams, Manager of Analytical Development and Validation here at Alcami. We do method development validation on drug products in my team, but I also oversee the ICP-MS analysis as well.
Hi, my name is Ashley Taylor, and I'm a senior scientist here at Alcami. I'm the subject matter expert for ICP-MS, and I do a lot of that testing and also a lot of the development and validation work.
We also have Julia Sproul in the room with us. She is a senior scientist in our elemental impurities analysis team as well. She's got a little bit of laryngitis today, though, so speaking for her. And I guess, so before we get started, this is our fourth elemental impurities webinar. We've done, I guess we started with a first kind of a more in-depth look at the regulatory changes. We had then had a kind of deep dive into the source of elemental impurities and the ways to mitigate those elemental impurities getting into the drug product. We then had a webinar at the end of last year to talk about the regulatory impact and kind of when filing needed to happen and how it should occur to be compliant with the new regulations. So this one is more of a focus on getting compliant if something has been missed, and maybe, so we'll have a brief overview of the changes, but then we'll go into a little bit more of Alcami's offerings and kind of the timelines and different options for becoming compliant with the new elemental impurities changes. So the first thing to know is why it's important to monitor elemental impurities. So elements have been shown, or heavy metals have been shown to be, dangerous and have negative effects on the human body. So that's the reason they're being monitored. That's the reason we've always monitored heavy metals, but that's kind of the driver for the change in how we're monitoring them, especially because many of these heavy metals build up over time. So it becomes important to control the amount of elemental impurities going into people through pharmaceuticals kind of across their entire life. In addition to that, elemental impurities can also, pose issues for drug products themselves. Some APIs and degradation pathways will occur in the presence of elemental impurities. So it's just kind of another reason why elemental impurities are important to monitor in drug products. And then how elemental impurities get into pharmaceutical products. So the first and major way is through the raw materials. So elemental impurities present in the API or any of the excipients, since that is what makes up the drug product, are the most common source of getting the elements into the drug product. So these can happen because some excipients come from natural sources. Some of them are mined out of the earth. So obviously there's a high potential for elemental impurities there. Others, use catalysts in the synthesis. So you have a potential to have a heavy metal that's used to synthesize something kind of left over. And if it's present in the API or the excipient, it will then, obviously translate into the drug product. Kind of two of the less likely sources. So one is just contamination from the manufacturing process. So that would be, from the stainless steel, from the environment of manufacturing, kind of picking up elements along the manufacturing of the drug product, or leaching metal impurities from the packaging components themselves. So the last two are less likely because they really require the drug product to kind of pick up the elements from the sources around them, and not just that it's inherent in them because it was, that's what the drug product is made of with the raw materials. So the reason for the change, so the current methods, well, they're no longer current. The previous methods, the heavy metals testing, very outdated techniques, some of them more than 100 years old. They're not very specific, and some of the techniques weren't very accurate either. And they weren't sensitive for all the metals, especially with all of the PDEs having been determined for so many different elemental impurities. And then the last and most important part is that monitoring previously was on the APIs and the excipients for heavy metals rather than on the drug products. So any of the kind of less likely sources, the water, the manufacturing process, the container closure itself, none of those sources were included in the elemental impurities when we were testing heavy metals to release raw materials. So what the new guideline is and where it's coming from. So the ICH published a Q3D for elemental impurities in December 2014. The FDA published its draft guideline in 2016. And this is, so the ICH has been aligned, the USP, FDA, EP, Europe, they all aligned with the ICH Q3D publication. So the limits, the elements, and everything are harmonized across really all of the regulatory bodies and the compendias. But so for the USP, this went into effect January 2018. So as of now, all commercial products and all products being filed have to be compliant with the new elemental impurities regulation. And for Europe and the EP, that went into effect in December 1st, 2017. So up until this point, we've been talking about that the filing was about to be required, and it was only required for all new filings. Now it's required for any currently commercial approved product and anything as it's being filed. So what the new guidelines apply to, so it's not very explicit in the ICH, but it is intended to apply to the drug product for human use. It does not, the limits and elements no longer apply directly to the drug substances or excipients, but as we'll kind of detail a little bit later, you have to consider the drug substance and excipients and the elemental impurities present in them are important to monitor to make sure that the drug product won't be over the control thresholds or over the limit. So while the limits aren't specifically on the drug substance or excipients, they are, it is important to monitor the elemental impurities there, or at least be aware of what's coming from those sources into the drug product. This guideline does not apply directly to dietary supplements. There is a different USP chapter. So the current USP for elemental impurities is USP 232 and 233, but there is a different chapter in the USP 2232 for elemental impurities of dietary supplements. The regulation does not apply to veterinary products, but what we've seen here recently in the last few months is we've had quite a few clients with veterinary products where we tell them it's not required to do the elemental impurities analysis according to the ICH and the guidelines, but we're hearing back from our clients that they're being told by whoever they're filing to, like CVM, that they have to be compliant with the elemental impurities regulations for the veterinary products as well. So if you are doing this for a veterinary product, it's may be prudent to go ahead and execute it like it was going into humans, or at least find out if you're going to need it before you get to your filing. And the new guideline, it also emphasizes using risk assessment over testing wherever possible. So we'll go into it. There are some reasons where it may be more cost effective, or just the only option is to just do testing for release of the drug product for the elemental impurities. But the agencies are looking for, and I guess they're pushing for risk assessment to be the approach where you would actually assess the risk and not do testing at time of release, but rather demonstrate that it's under control and that you'll manage its life cycle. So one of the biggest changes with the new elemental impurities is we're going from a kind of wet chemistry heavy metal test to a new technique. So it's going from wet chemistry to an ICP-MS or ICP-OES. That's described very clearly in USP 232, 233. And like I said before, the limits are kind of shifting. So where up until recently the limits have been on the APIs and the excipients for heavy metals, the limits have now been shifted to the drug product. It's no longer required that the heavy metals be tested on excipients and APIs when they're being released, but rather on the drug product before it goes into the market. So the elements and limits, so there are a few tables. The tables are harmonized, but there's one in USP. The EP has one. There's the ICH document and the FDA guideline, they all have the same tables that talk about the classes of elements, their limits, and relative to the PDE. But there are three classes of elements. They're classified. You have class 1, 2, and 3, and this is determined by the toxicity of the element and its likelihood of occurring. Which ones need to be analyzed for? There's also another table in the ICH and USP which talks about, based on the route of administration, it tells you which elements you are required to include in addition to any intentionally added ones. So there are three routes of administration that are provided in those tables. There's oral route of administration, injectables, and inhalation. But that's really, it's using an exposure factor to set the limits. So if you have like a topical ointment or some other route of administration, there are, there is another document where you can determine what the exposure factor is. And if it's the same as oral, then you would follow the oral guidelines. If it's the same as an inhalation, you would follow the inhalation guidelines. So if there's a different route of administration, that's what you would use to determine which of the, which limits and elements you need to select for. And the last part of the elements is the maximum daily dose. So the maximum daily dose of the drug product is used to calculate the limits. There are some options. There's like an option 1, which assumes a 10-gram daily dose or less, but that 10 grams or the daily dose is based on the weight of the entire drug product that's being delivered. It's not the API. It's not the dose of the API, but rather the weight of the entire dose in a day. And there are there are extenuating circumstances where sometimes it's a single dose product or it's a short-term something where you only use it for 30 days, but there is there's nothing in the guidelines that allows for different limits for those. But it does recognize in the guidelines that if something like that occurs, those are justifications for widening the limits, but they should be assessed against the current limits based on what the maximum daily dose is, even if it's a single dose. So there are two strategies to be that are recommended or that are offered. One is the risk assessment, which we talked about before. The risk assessment is a risk-based approach for demonstrating control of the elemental impurities. This approach would require some testing. It would have scientific knowledge and literature possibly referenced. You would have data either from testing or provided by the suppliers for the API and excipients on what elemental impurities are present and that they're below the limits, along with demonstrating control of the elemental impurities on the drug product. And it's control and variability. So the control limit is 30% of the PDE that is listed in the guideline of the limits. So if it's less than 30% on 3 registration, full-scale lots, then it's considered under control and the variability has been assessed and that no additional controls are needed for those elemental impurities. You could also do it on 6 pivotal batches, but it's really based on demonstrating control and variability of the elemental impurities. And for that reason, you also have to consider the API and excipients, and it's recommended to do testing on the API and excipients if you can't get data from the suppliers for the elemental impurities to include in that risk assessment to show that there's no variability concerns from any of those other sources as well. And the reason, again, that we're doing testing on the drug product and you cannot do a summation approach like for residual solvents is that the container closure and the manufacturing process itself contributes to the elemental impurities. And the second, way to be compliant is testing of the drug product at release. So you have to have a fully validated method and specification limits for this. There's a couple reasons it may be necessary. It would be needed if your risk assessment shows that you don't have sufficient control over elemental impurities in the drug product, that you're over the control limit. So one of the additional controls put in place could be to do testing of the element or elements that you're over the control limit for. And the other reason may be if it's something that doesn't really plan to ever have a lot of batches made. If you're going to make 1 batch a year or something like that, there may never be enough batches created to be able to demonstrate the risk assessment. The alternative to that would be that if you could start with a drug product testing at release for elemental impurities and then over time build up the data to then do a risk assessment filing report to then not have to continue testing. So that's kind of the overview of the guidelines and what is needed. What we've got here is just a flow chart to kind of talk about the different options that we have. So this is going to kind of shift a little bit more to what Alcami can offer in its timelines. But just kind of a general flow of how the risk assessment or release testing, can usually occur. So you can do R&D screening, where you just kind of do a quick and dirty screening of the elemental impurities to see if maybe there's something that you should be considering that you're not, but or that you just don't know if it should be considered. You could do a screening on it. There's risk assessment testing, which is something that Alcami offers, and you could either kind of move to a method validation and into release testing from there, or depending on its results, could move right into a risk assessment filing report. And then there's the ongoing lifecycle management, which would be something that's based on changes to the process. And then I guess similar to where the validation may come in, you may have to do something like method development depending on what the R&D screening or other work being done shows. So that's kind of the different options. And then we'll go back through this at the end and provide a couple examples of things we've seen with the clients we've done this work for to date.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Ashley again, and I apologize for the scratchy voice. It's allergy season here in Wilmington. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the offerings that Alcami has for elemental impurities testing. One of the things that it's not required. You can certainly go straight into a method development type project or risk assessment testing, but we have seen that it can be very valuable to do some type of R&D screening up front. So one of the things may be, if you look at the ICH document, it gives you, like Chris said, the required elements based on route of administration. But there's also kind of that table that says, well, if it's intentionally added, then you may need to include it as well. Sometimes we find that people can't get a lot of great information from their suppliers and they're just not sure. So doing a screening up front can help provide that information, kind of let you know if there's any other kind of problem elements that you may need to consider in your risk assessment testing or in your release testing. Also, like Chris said, there are some elemental impurities that can have product quality concerns. So this is another good tool, doing some type of preliminary screening to let you know if you have an element like aluminum or iron that can potentially be harmful to the product quality of the drug product. So with that being said, we have two general R&D methods here at Alcami. We have a semi-quantitative screening. This is going to be your absolute most cost-effective screening. It screens for about 55 elements. It does not account for the sample matrix, so that's one thing to consider. It's really quick and dirty, but it does give you a lot of information pretty quickly. It basically works by using an algorithm to extrapolate data for all the elements that aren't contained within the single point standard. The other option that we have, which is pretty popular, is to do a full quantitative screening. So this is going to use an external calibration curve with multiple standards, and those standards are going to contain all of the elements that we're looking for. We can do this just as a quick screen. We can also modify that or customize that to also show the impact of the sample matrix on the analytes of interest. This is another very efficient and fairly cost-effective approach that we have. Moving on, so as Chris mentioned, you kind of have there's the two approaches. One is the risk assessment testing approach, which is the preferred approach. And then we also have the development and validation. So for our risk assessment testing, this is a general Alcami method, but we're going to customize it to your specific drug product or raw material or drug substance. When we do that, we're going to demonstrate specificity, linearity. We're going to do accuracy at single points, so at 25, 100, and 200% of the elemental impurity limit. Again, these limits are going to be customized based on your specific drug product's route of administration and the maximum daily dosage. We'll also demonstrate sensitivity as well as precision. So this is a intended use validation or qualification, which is suitable for filing your risk assessment report. With that, we will do testing of additional lots, test those to give you the data. So it's preferred that you do 3 full-scale lots. You can also use 6 engineering lots. The good thing about this is if you don't have those 3 lots right up front, we can do the risk assessment testing to demonstrate those phase-appropriate validation studies and then test additional lots at a later date. So part of the deliverables for this risk assessment testing is going to be done per material. So if you want to do the drug product, you want to do the drug substance and any excipients, each one will have its own risk assessment testing report. And in that report, you're going to get all the validation study results. You'll get the actual elemental impurity results for your samples. And you'll also get a method summary that's going to let you know the details of how the solutions were prepared, as well as the instrument operating parameters and acquisition parameters. One great thing about this particular approach is that if the risk assessment testing did show something was above that control threshold, that 30% of the limit, you could then go directly from risk assessment testing into a full method validation. So we can generate a protocol based on the method that we used for your risk assessment testing and validate. And we could do it for all of the elements, or we could do it for, just a few selected ones that may have been above that control threshold. Equally, if you wanted to go, like Chris said, there's some cases where risk assessment testing is just not going to be the most viable approach. If you're only looking to make 1 batch a year, or maybe just 1 batch, we've even seen 1 batch every couple of years. It may take you a while to kind of build up that data. So in those cases, we would probably recommend method development and full validation. So for our method development, we are going to customize a method for your specific sample. So one of the first things we're going to do is, of course, determine what the appropriate sample preparation needs to be. Some drug products and materials are, much more soluble than others. So we'll determine things like whether or not we need to use microwave-assisted digestion, if we need to use any type of organic solvents. All those things will be determined in the method development, and then we'll establish appropriate standard preparations, make sure that we can get appropriate linearity. We're also going to, again, look at an accuracy range of 25 to 200%. We like to go to 25%, so we're just a little bit under that control threshold. We feel like that gives our clients a little bit extra data, so if there's ever a situation where a result is starting to creep up on that control threshold, you can see it because you'll have a reporting limit that's just a little bit below it. Also, we're going to establish method parameters, acquisition parameters. We're going to make sure that the method has appropriate precision and that it's viable for validation. From that, you will get a method validation protocol, and attached to that will be the draft test procedure, the proposed test procedure that we're going to validate. Additionally, if you require a method development report that details, kind of the, all the trials that we went through and the results for that, we can also provide that as well. So speaking a little bit about method validation, again, this is a point that you can end up either from development or the risk assessment testing. For this, our standard approach is to perform the method validation parameters as detailed in USP. So we're going to demonstrate specificity. We'll look at the contributions of the diluent solution and use that to show that there's no interferences. We will also demonstrate linearity through system suitability. Again, we're going to do a full accuracy by recovery study. So that's triplicate preparations at 25 and 200% of the limit. And then we'll do 6 preparations at 100% of the limit to serve for the accuracy by recovery study, as well as method repeatability. We will also have the second analyst portion to demonstrate intermediate precision, where they're going to repeat those 6 preps at 100% of the limit. Additionally, we'll establish stability of the standard and sample solutions and also the limit of quantitation. Your deliverable for this is, of course, going to be a method validation report that details all of the results obtained during the validation, and most importantly, you're going to have that validated test procedure that you can then put on your specification. One of the good things about the method validation, if you are someone who has limited lots that are being manufactured, you can, because we're doing, again, that accuracy is starting at below 0.3J instead of 0.5J, like it says in USP, you can acquire this data, this release testing data over years, and eventually make a case to drop elemental impurities from your specification, because that's going to still allow you to demonstrate that you're below the control threshold. It just may take you a little bit longer to get there. Another option that we have here at Alcami that can be very helpful is our risk assessment regulatory report. This is a very broad report. It's unlike the test report that is the deliverable from each specific risk assessment testing project. This one is going to take a drug product and look at the entire scope of it. So for this report, we'll actually generate this, and it can be used for filing purposes. So this can be very helpful. We can either do all of the testing to include elemental impurities testing on the drug product, the drug substance, and any of the major or high-risk excipients, or if there's data from the drug substance supplier or a raw material supplier, we can actually include that into this report, as long as it's appropriate for the limits and elements for that specific drug product. In this report, we're really going to go through that fishbone diagram that's in the ICH and touch on each of those pieces. So we will speak to not just the drug product itself and the drug substance, but we'll speak to the manufacturing equipment, kind of make a statement. Is it under GMP controls? We'll speak to the utilities. So water is an important one. Although it's low risk, you still have to, speak to the fact that that water system is under GMP controls. If there were any extractable and leachable studies performed, then we will also include that data and information as well. As far as the container closure system goes, it's not always necessary to do extractable, leachable studies. That's going to be really dependent upon the form of the drug product. Obviously, parenteral drug products, any type of liquid product, is probably going to need those extractable, leachable studies for elemental impurities. You wouldn't need it for oral solid dose. So that's something we'll speak to in the report as well. This report can be customized, so we understand that not everyone may have the time to get as much data, so they want a report that they can file with and maybe supplement later. So that's something we can certainly do. We can customize it, and then as more information or more testing is performed, we can actually update that report as needed. It's also going to draw a conclusion at the end. So if we did see something that was above that control threshold, at that point we can say, either that the element needs additional controls, or if we've already done a validation and have a validated test procedure, we can actually put that in the conclusion as well. So it's very customizable, and we found it to be very helpful. So this is just a timeline, kind of breaking down all of the testing that I've just talked about. The bars in the blue are what are the Alcami standard turnaround time. So I've we've put this kind of in the occurrence of how it would happen. Now, again, the R&D screening is not required. It's something that we recommend if you don't have a lot of data or historical information on your raw materials or your drug product, but it's certainly not required. So if you wanted to skip that, this would obviously start, a week or 2 weeks earlier. depending on whether or not you wanted standard or rush testing. So you can see that, you know, from the R&D screening, we're going to go into either risk assessment testing or method development. And then from there, you would either move into method validation, risk assessment, regulatory report, and then if needed, the routine testing is the last piece. And then you can see we do have, one of the things here at Alcami is we do have ICP-MS and elemental impurities testing going on at multiple sites. So that does give us the capacity we need to allow for the rush testing. So we felt it was important to kind of show, you know, both the standard and the rush testing timelines. And then one of the things that we found very helpful, especially because we realized that a lot of people, you know, they're on a tight timeline, trying to get into compliance with these new regulations. So one of the things we found helpful is, you know, if you're making an inquiry about testing, these are items that are very helpful to kind of have up front, because they help us to better scope the work for the quoting process, but they also ensure that we can go ahead and calculate limits and get all the necessary forms filled out and sent to you, ideally so that we have everything signed and ready to go when the samples arrive. And so these main things are the route of administration. Again, if it's not oral dose, parenteral dose, or inhalation dose, just let us know that route of administration. And in most cases, we're able to look at the exposure factor and determine which route of administration to use in ICH. If you know it, the catalyst information for the drug substance, or if there's any intentionally added elements. If you don't know it, this may be a great spot where you might want to consider one of those R&D screening methods that I spoke about. Or in either case, you might have to reach out to your raw material supplier. And then we also need to know the maximum daily dosage, because as Chris said, that's how we're going to calculate from the PDE to the elemental impurity limits. And then another great thing to know is how many lots you have available for testing, because that really kind of helps to determine whether or not risk assessment is going to be the most appropriate, or if development and validation and release testing will be more appropriate. And then if you have any other regulatory concerns, so we understand that there are people that are filing, you know, all over the world. So you may have some concerns about, you know, say EMEA has a guideline on metal catalysts, residual metal catalysts. So that particular guideline has most of the same elements and limits as does ICH, but there are a few added elements that may be of concern. It may be something, you know, like Health Canada, they have a slightly different limits than or what an ICH, as does the California Prop 65. So any things like that you can provide to us up front when we're scoping the work can be very valuable in helping expedite the testing.
And then kind of the last thing to go over was a few things we've done for our clients here recently. So to start with the R&D screening, we've had this used very early on in the phase of products, where maybe people are looking at the excipients or the materials and kind of just want to get a feel for the elemental impurities present as they're kind of making decisions on what they're going to use, or even vendors or anything like that. We've also seen the R&D screening used as a tool to determine if they were going to move towards the risk assessment approach, or if they wanted to just go towards development and validation, if they felt that after screening, you know, X number of lots of material, if they would need to, if they would be more comfortable with validation and release testing, or if they felt like their elements were going to be low enough to proceed with just risk assessment testing. We've had quite a few clients where we do risk assessment testing. That risk assessment testing, as you know, I guess Ashley described, it does demonstrate, you know, intended use validation and is suitable to be included in filing. We've had, you know, where we perform it on the drug product, multiple lots of it. We've had it where we do it on the API and every excipient, you know, 3 lots of the API, 3 lots of all the excipients, and 3 lots of the drug product, and write that filing report. You know, and then we've had, you know, different iterations of all those where you do the testing on multiple or even more lots, or, you know, what Alcami recommends for risk assessment would be 3 lots of the API, 3 lots of 2 or 3 of the major or high risk excipients. So if there's something like talc, which is mined, that's one that should always be considered high risk. Or if the I guess the the proportion of the dose for an excipient is very large. Like if you're 50% of your drug product is an excipient, that's an excipient that's worth testing to determine if there's like a very low, I guess if there's an excipient that's at like 0.1% or something like that, it's not very, it doesn't, in our opinion, it doesn't need to be screened or analyzed because it plays such a small part in the overall results. Plus the drug product will be screened anyway, but any of the major excipients in the API definitely to screen. We've had other clients and we've had successful filings, and we have current commercial products that they validated methods and did release testing. And, we didn't have there weren't any comments or anything that, to our knowledge, that came back for those filings following that approach. And we've, I guess back to the risk assessment, we have spoken with the FDA and USP about our approach and haven't had any concerns with the risk assessment approach that we've been taking.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. So just to kind of follow the flow chart too, so, we kind of laid it out so that you could see, we've had instances where we go from the R&D screen to the risk assessment testing. Something is above the control threshold. So we validate that risk assessment test method so that we can add those particular elements that were not under control to the release testing specification. And then simultaneously, we're working on doing the risk assessment regulatory report. The other option, again, is, to go the other way, just start with development validation right into release testing. The one thing that I think we wanted to point out, too, that's pretty important, if you do take the risk assessment testing approach and not the release testing approach, one of the most key and critical things to remember is the management, the ongoing life cycle management of that drug product. So because we've assessed, certain raw material suppliers, certain container closure systems, if any of that kind of stuff changes, if the API production changes, then all of those things need to be managed so that they can be assessed and determine if additional data needs to be collected to supplement the filing report.
And I guess one last thing before we jump into questions. So we talked about extractables and leachables a little bit. We actually do perform that work here at Alcami. We have a white paper for extractables and leachables that can be made available to everybody. And also those other 3 webinars that I spoke about at the beginning, those are available for download and viewing online if you, are looking for more of that information or, what we'd discussed in the previous webinars, because there hasn't been, besides the beginning introduction, there's been kind of different content in each of them.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Ashley. Now we'd like to begin the Q&A portion of today's presentation. And I see a few came in along the way, but as you have them, feel free to type them into the questions tab and we will answer them. So first, how many batches do you recommend for the risk assessment study, and what type of batch? Is it a submission batch or a trial one?
So we recommend a minimum of 3 batches. I guess that's kind of pointed out in the ICH for the drug product, that's the requirement for showing, variability. I guess if available, we would recommend the registration batches or a full-scale batch. I think if it's a smaller scale batch or maybe like a pivotal one, I think we recommend going a little bit above 3 batches, maybe like 6 or something like that. But we've had other ones. So for current commercial products, you can have, something that's been expired because the elemental impurities shouldn't change kind of over time. So it can be an old lot and a recently produced one and kind of picked from different areas of the life cycle of the product. Or, I guess if we're at kind of a launch point or filing, then it can be done on the 3 registration batches. I guess the testing isn't, it's required before filing, but it's not something where you need like the ICP-MS method in place prior to the registration batches being made.
Okay. Should we validate the procedure during the risk assessment study?
So for the actual risk assessment testing project, you can almost consider that more like the development, like a development and a intended use validation all rolled into one. So we wouldn't really validate simultaneously. So we would need to complete that project in order to produce a validation protocol. So typically we can do that pretty quickly and get the protocol ready to go within, sometimes as quickly as a day or 2 after completion of that risk assessment testing.
Yeah, and then to add to that, we don't usually, unless we find that an element is above the control threshold, we don't recommend validating it unless it's needed for release testing and that there'd be something on the specification for that element.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we can, we can also perform testing of additional lots submitted at a later date, even without fully validating it. We will still have that method summary that's included in the report that we can test against.
Okay. We have multiple strength, dose proportional. Which strength will be used as validation matrix? And what if not dose proportional?
So for dose proportional, I guess tablets or something like that, then it would be, I guess we're gonna grind it up when we use it. I guess if it is truly dose proportional and there's nothing different in the formulation, there's not really a requirement between which strength is used for the screening. Obviously, you would want to do the testing on still at least 3 lots. I mean, I guess if available, you could choose different strengths for each of them, but you would only, I guess you would consider any of the strengths, individual batches. I would say you want individual batches of the blend itself, though. You wouldn't test 3 dose proportional strengths all made from a common blend. You would want 3 different runs through the manufacturing process at least. And then for not dose proportional, I guess we've had some of these where we can kind of take a worst case approach on doing the risk assessment methodology. Like if we have, say the difference is only that there are 2 different strengths and there's a different coating. We've had it where we do the risk assessment work on a worst case sample where we may take the coating of the one and spike it into the other when we're doing the recovery studies to show that the method would work in the presence of both. If you have different strengths that I guess are completely different formulations, they would need to be handled completely separately, where you would have risk assessment on 3 lots of one and 3 lots of the other.
If the API supplier or excipient manufacturer give the risk assessment, do we still need to perform the risk assessment testing for drug products?
So if they have data that supports the required elements that are in ICH for the route of administration that you will be using that drug substance in, and the limits are appropriate based on your drug product's maximum daily dosage, then yes, you can include that in your risk assessment. It would be ideal to also ensure that it was that particular supplier tested more than just one batch. The agency preference would be to show variations. So ideally, yes, you can use it if the limits and elements are appropriate and there were multiple batches tested.
But the drug product still should be tested because it has to, without testing the drug product, you can't speak to the elemental impurities coming from container closure and the manufacturing process itself.
Do you have any limitations on potent materials or controlled substances?
Actually, that's a good question. We are able to handle controlled substances here at Alcami, so that's not an issue at any of our sites. We've also put a lot of investment into our ability to handle potent compounds and highly potent compounds. So we have special rooms. We have all the necessary programs in place to handle the majority of those compounds.
Is there a way to have a timeline that's quicker than what was shown here?
Yes, it is possible. I mean, I guess we kind of showed the timeline that has, I guess standard testing and the rush testing, but I mean, for special circumstances, we have moved even faster than our expedited turnaround. I mean, obviously we need a lot of collaboration with the clients to get everything in place and move quickly, but it is possible to, move at a rate that's even faster than our expedited turnaround.
Are there any more questions? Okay. Well, if anyone thinks of any more questions later on, please feel free to direct those questions to Chris Williams or Julia Sproul, whose email addresses you can see up on the screen right now. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it has been recorded and you will receive a follow-up email in the next few days with a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides that are presented today. And also, as Chris mentioned earlier, in that email, we will provide links to the previous 3 webinars on elemental impurities that were presented that you can watch on demand, and also a link to the extractables and leachables white paper that we have. We got one more question that came in here. Do we fully screen the drug product?
I'm not sure if I 100% understand the question, but I'm thinking that maybe you're asking, do we do all 24 of the elements in ICH-Q3D? If that's the case, then it's our stance to do the ones that are only required. So now we do understand that sometimes you don't know about the intentionally added elements, in which case we are able to do risk assessment testing on more than just the required. We are capable of running for all 24. We can even add on to those additional elements that are in EMEA, as well as any other elements that are concerned. So we can certainly customize an approach for your specific project.
Great. Well, thank you. And with that, we'll say thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day.